AJ Live. We have a wonderful presentation today from a wonderful plant-based doctor in Colorado. He's been on my radar for some time. We've crossed paths at so many of these conferences, but he's so busy working as a doctor, we never really got time to get to know each other or chat. So I'm very excited to spend this time with him today. And he's actually doing a presentation, which you can see. The slide is on the screen already. It's called 2020, the Year of Clarity in Plant-Based Living. Please welcome from Colorado, a wonderful cardiologist named Dr. Andrew Freeman. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to learn from you.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's been a long time coming, I think, to connect and share with your viewers some of the great data. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm a cardiologist at National Jewish in Denver. My contact info, Twitter, etc. are there. You can also find me on a site that I don't have a lot of time to update called vegancardiologist.com. But every year I actually comb through the literature as an academic and try to figure out what's being said. And it's pretty amazing every single year how much data comes out and is shared, but is often very little known to the general public and even to us as physicians. So I'm really hoping to spotlight that today. And again, this is just in the last year. Let's see. There we go. Also, want to remind everyone, it's impossible to do a nutrition study without imprisoning people and force feeding them and doing all sorts of things that would not be ethical. So really what this is there's a lot of signal in the noise, even though there's some noise, and it's really impossible to do it without noise. I always try to start with something funny. The truth is when you're the only vegan at work, and in my institution, I am the only vegan, only plant-based doctor. In fact, there's two of us in the state of Colorado as cardiologists, and believe it or not, one's on sabbatical, so it's really just me. But it does feel like I'm the big bird in the crowd there. But you may have seen in the last couple of weeks to months that we're in serious trouble, particularly in this country. Here's a New York Times, Wall Street Journal expose. It was also in the Times as well. America's biggest killer is starting to become a major comeback. And if you take a look, heart disease is on the rise again. So we did make some great headway. But lifestyle is starting to not be ideal again for a lot of folks. And so my hope is to change that. And here it is again. It says, heart disease strikes back across the U.S., even in healthy places. This is actually in Colorado, my home state. And as I was just sharing with Chef AJ, it's actually the quote unquote healthiest or most active state. But believe it or not, it also has the highest and fastest growing obesity and diabetic epidemic among non-white Hispanics. So the race divide is certainly showing up in lots of different places now. And so in this journal's analysis, 3 metro areas in Colorado Rocky Mountains recorded some of the biggest increases, rose by 25%. And the 3 cities boast robust access to exercise, healthcare, bike trails, mountain climbing, snowshoeing, you name it, we have it. So, this was in The Week, which I really love, by the way. It's a great little magazine that comes out and summarizes all the world's stuff, if you will, every week in a very short little journal. But basically they said, Americans are collectively gaining weight at an alarming rate, with the average adult weighing 15 pounds more than 20 years ago. So we're in some serious trouble, and about 40% of US adults and 20% of children are obese. So not just overweight, but obese. And believe it or not, in 1985, no state in the U.S. had an obesity rate of about 15%, and now every state is higher than 20. Pretty scary. And then more Americans say they weighed 200 pounds or more this decade. It's very, very interesting. If you look at the trends, it's actually amongst women in particular where some of the greatest weight gain is showing up. So 54% on average say they want to lose weight, down from 59% in the previous decade, but fewer Americans consider themselves overweight or obese. Is this the new norm? And it really does appear to be the way. In our own clinic, we just replaced the chairs, believe it or not, and we now have double wide chairs in every room as the standard. And when I sit in one of these chairs, you could fit 2 of them. So pretty scary. And if you look, here is the prevalence of overall obesity and severe obesity on the right. And you can see as time goes on, just how much more is going on. 50% by 2030, that's 50%. And if that's not enough, this came out recently, and you may have seen this in other places, but this was the health effects of dietary risk in 195 countries, all the way up through 2017. And nearly 40 countries were studied. It was the most comprehensive diet yet. And what it really showed was that poor diets were responsible for about 11 million deaths, or 22% of all deaths in 2017, and 255 million disability-adjusted life years, which is the equal sum of years life lost and years lived with disability. So poor diet represents 16% of these disability-adjusted life years. And in comparison, tobacco claims 8 million deaths, high blood pressure 10.4 million deaths, poor diets 10.9, almost 11 million deaths. And risky diets that were poor were also significantly associated with cardiovascular disease. Countries at all levels of the various indices that are measured for their socioeconomic status, but basically the same 4 leading dietary risks: high sodium, low whole grains, low fruit, and low nuts and seeds. And the 4 leading dietary risks are those. And believe it or not, without vegetables either. And the impacts of this are huge. So if you look, it accounted for more than 50% of diet-related deaths and 66% of disability-adjusted life years. The other 50% and 34% of disability-adjusted life years were attributed to high consumption of red meat, processed meats, and sugar-sweetened beverages, and trans fatty acids, believe it or not, which are still out there. And believe it or not, if you look at this analysis, Uzbekistan has the highest rate of diet-related deaths. So if you go there, plan on bringing your own food. And Israel, believe it or not, has the lowest rate of diet-related deaths. And interestingly, they also have the most vegans per capita in the world. So it may not be the land of milk and honeys for much longer. Nutrition and medical education. This was a really interesting study that came out. And basically what they said is, despite the centrality of nutrition and healthy lifestyle, we're not, as medical students, supported to provide this education. We don't get this education, and it could be enhanced if we were to significantly change this for doctors in the 21st century. And this was in the Lancet, which, as you may know, is sort of the New England Journal of Medicine of Europe. It's a really big journal that's widely read. And they actually are responsible for a number of publications in the last couple of years showing just how scary our planet is going to become if we don't change. And then interestingly, as I kind of comb through the rest of the data, I think you'll be pretty surprised to see that there's really almost no area of medicine that diet doesn't actually hit. So this was an interesting one. Obesity raises asthma risk, not a new thing, but there's actually some studies suggesting that fat infiltration of the airways may be part of the blame. And interestingly, as you get bigger, there's more fatty tissue, and then the asthma severity can be worse. And then I have about gut flora. So for those of you that have heard me speak in years past, I've talked a lot about TMAO, but in this review, in conclusion, the literature suggests that a vegetarian or vegan diet was significantly effective in promoting a diverse ecosystem of beneficial bacteria. And when we increase fiber, we get more of this beneficial bacteria, and this reduces inflammation and cardiovascular risk. And a lot of that has to do with that TMAO that we spoke about in years past. It also increases short-chain fatty acids, which also improve immune function. So if you're plant-based, it's really important to differentiate the healthy plant-based versus unhealthy plant-based. So you could get away with eating Oreo cookies, potato chips, and Coca-Cola and call yourself plant-based, but you might be at significantly higher risk than someone who isn't even an omnivore, believe it or not. So this was an interesting study that showed that if you look at it carefully, when they look at healthful and unhealthful plant-based diets, the ones that were unhealthy, and these are the ones here in red, in blue, which is the healthy and unhealthy plant-based diet indices. This is the hazard ratio for coronary heart disease. You can see that overall, the healthy plant-based diet index is the best. And then as you get to unhealthy, which is this dashed line, you can see the risk goes up significantly. So it's pretty important that you eat well when you're eating plant-based. And this was another interesting study. About 127,000 participants were analyzed from the Nurses' Health Study and several of their follow-up studies, as well as the Health Professionals follow-up study, followed for 20 years. But those who ate more plant-based foods gained less weight over the years. And as you know, as we all get older, we tend to gain weight. And a lot of that is because our metabolism sometimes slows, which doesn't have to be the case, but is commonly the case. And we also know that participants from a 12-week nutrition education program, when they followed this and were educated about and understood it, they had an average weight loss of about 11 pounds, lowered their cholesterol, and dropped their waist circumference. And all were very significant based on statistical analysis. And then, as you probably know, in the last year, you can now go to all your favorite fast food places and find vegan or plant-based burgers, right? So if you look, the Impossible Whopper costs $1 more than the original Whopper. Calories are about the same. Fat is perhaps a little bit less. Saturated fat is about the same. Salt is much more. Protein is pretty similar. In some parts of the world, even McDonald's has a McVegan you can buy, and it's almost another $2 or so more than the Big Mac. Has about the same number of calories, close in fat, believe it or not, more saturated fat. White Castle's has these Impossible sliders, $2 each compared to 72 cents for the original one. More fat, more saturated fat, more salt. You can even get a Beyond Taco over at Del Taco, and you can see that all these Impossible and Beyond Meats, as tasty as they are truly not very helpful. In fact, the vast majority of them are big blocks of saturated fat or coconut oil. And if you ever cook one of these things, you'll see that they don't just cook, they actually ignite when you cook them. And that's because it's a big block of fat. So really use these sparingly, if at all. Another comparison, people say, well, what if I eat Beyond versus Impossible? Believe it or not, the calories are about the same, the protein's about the same, fat's a bit more in the Beyond one, saturated fat's a little bit less, salt is about the same, they're all vegan, but the Beyond one is non-GMO, soy, and gluten-free. The Impossible has some soy and non-GMO. This is a pea protein isolate. This is a soy potato, and there's some heme that's created in yeast in the Impossible burger. And then remember, it's impossible to go out to a Burger King, White Castle, or any of these places and avoid all the usual stuff too. So even if you eat a more quote-unquote healthful plant-based burger, you probably end up with fries, soda, and desserts. And of course, all these burgers come with cheese, which makes them not plant-based. So you have to really make some adjustments. So food for thought, try not to go to places that have a drive-through. And then, as you may have seen, all these meatless brands are truly heating up. And if you've had the ability to invest in some of these, you might have earned quite a profit. And I would tell you that for the environment and for overall health, these are likely far better than the beef versions, but I would not consume them regularly only because they're not helpful. This is the Carl's Jr. one, which was not mentioned in the previous one, but notice it comes with mayo and cheese on it, even though it's a plant-based burger. And it's been sizzling this last summer with faux meat brands securing big deals weekly with lots of media coverage. But then people are also now going back into the biblical age. You may have heard of this thing called the Daniel diet, perhaps the original vegan diet. And basically, if you look in the Bible, Daniel ate no meat and was very healthful. So they actually did study this in more recent times. This is not from the last year. 43 subjects, 21-day exclusively following the Daniel diet, had marked improvements, as you would expect, in blood pressure, cholesterol, insulin, and C-reactive protein. So if you see this, the Daniel diet is a code word for the plant-based diet, which is, of course, in the Bible. And if you really want to become a Bible historian, it's very interesting. I always joke with my patients, but if you look in the time of Noah, if you believe in this, and the ark was built, he was eating no animals, obviously, and they lived to about 600 years old. And when the ark landed, everyone started eating those animals, and now we live to be 120. So maybe there's something to it, I don't know. But you might get a kick out of this. So this was also recently published. These were Inuit mummies. And despite presumably living a physically active lifestyle and eating a diet rich in omega-3 fatty acids, 3 or 4 Inuit adolescent or young adult mummies who lived 500 years ago actually had coronary or vascular calcification. So the lifestyles of years past were typically claimed by weather, animal injuries, or trauma. So they never lived long enough to really get coronary disease. But interestingly, when they were mummified, they actually had coronary disease. And this has actually been shown in Egyptian mummies that had CAT scans back a couple of years ago. So this was in the New York Times, and basically it said here, to treat chronic ailments, fix diet first. And this was October 2019, if you didn't see it. And basically they said that California's version of Medicaid, Medi-Cal, introduced a 3-year pilot study that's already showing what experts in the healthcare field have seen. Tailored nutrition improves health and lowers medical costs. Surprise, surprise. And we know this for a long time, right? In Loma Linda, California, the home of the Seventh-day Adventist, it's the only blue zone in the United States. And why? These are people who eat low-fat, whole food, plant-based foods as part of their religion. So they've been studied. This is the Adventist study 2. They had 33% less early death, less cancer. Blacks that were enrolled in the study had 36% less death. And in general, they had less overall cardiovascular disease. And they also were non-smokers, they exercised, they had a vegetarian diet. I also get this every year, so I show this slide every year. People say to me, well, doc, where do you get all your protein? You know, we've all been programmed by the meat and egg and dairy industry to think that we're protein deficient. In all the years I've been treating medicine, and as young as I may look, I've been treating medicine for a while. I have never treated protein deficiency in the United States, never treated protein deficiency in the US. Usually you have to be calorie deficient to be protein deficient. Remember that pound for pound, spinach, kale, broccoli, they actually have more protein than a steak. I always ask my patients, well, where do you think the cow, the chicken, and the pig get their protein? They get it from kale, spinach, broccoli, corn, and other things. So keep in mind, you can get plenty of protein without even trying. And most of us, you know, unless you're a very large person or an avid weightlifter, you really only need 30 or 40 grams per day. You know, I'm always in an uphill battle, right? You know, it used to be that doctors told doctors to smoke, doctors told patients to smoke, more doctors were smoking Camels than any other cigarette. And my doctor told me I needed to eat meat. If you find a doctor who says that to you and you tell them you're really not interested, it might not be a bad idea to find a different doctor who's a little bit more knowledgeable. As you may know, I've spoken in years past, we surveyed 1,000 cardiologists and I published this data. About 90% of us know nothing about nutrition. So make sure you know what you're doing. How about in cholesterol in the last year? So this was a study, 51% participants followed 3 diets, low in saturated fat, red meat, white meat, no meat separately. Then they did the same thing with high saturated fat diets, drawing their protein from the same red, white, or non-meat sources. And both the white and red meat raised LDL cholesterol compared with plant-based proteins. No difference in the meat source and better, of course, without. How about breast cancer? Many of you know that I've talked about this many times before, but breast cancer and diet are intimately related. This was an interesting study of about 49,000 postmenopausal women. They examined the incidence rates and death from breast cancer with a normal diet, 32% calories from fat in the United States, versus a fat reduction and with increased fruit, vegetable, and grain consumption. And those in that diet did much better and had less death. And we know that fat and cholesterol and animal products are highly associated with the development of breast cancer. And then, believe it or not, interestingly, there is a pathogen that was recently identified called bovine milk and meat factors, and they're found in healthy cows, and they think that it may cause a chronic inflammation in tissues such as breast, colon, and promote cancer. And cancer may take decades to manifest after the person consumes the milk or the meat. And so these BMMFs, as they're causing them, are the new pathogen, similar to some forms of virus or bacteria. They're called plasmadomes. So if you hear this, stay away from it. Interestingly, Walter Willett, many of you know, really strong nutrition advocate, just published this review in New England Journal of Medicine in February. Talked a lot about milk products and health. And he said, in our opinion, the current recommendation to greatly increase consumption of dairy does not appear to be justified. And a lot of this comes from the dairy industry. The optimal intake of milk will depend on overall diet quality. If it's low, especially for children in low-income environments, dairy foods can improve nutrition, but if the diet quality is high, you don't need it at all. And what does it take to eat a diet quality that's high? I always call it the peasant diet: beans, rice, and vegetables, right? It's relatively inexpensive if it's done well. You don't need any processed or fake meats, and you don't need the most remotely sourced vegetables and fruits, right? Superfoods are found in your grocery store every day. Spinach, cucumbers, kale, broccoli, anything at all in the produce section, they're superfoods, believe it or not. You don't need acai berries or anything else. How about this? You might remember these covers from back in the day, maybe for those of you in your 60s or above. Butter, it's good for you, right? It's slippery, and that's why we eat as much as possible to lubricate our arteries and veins. Please do not follow this advice. Please do not eat butter with a fork. Please do not go to the state fair and eat fried butter sticks. These are things that will likely hurt you, as tasty as they may be. How about diabetes? So many of us continue to face this uphill battle where, you know, it is true that carb control or reduction can lower sugar, but it does not cure diabetes. That's really a disease of fat excess. And if you eat a whole food, low-fat, plant-based diet, you can significantly reduce diabetes or even cure it. And this has been shown as early as the 1940s by Dr. Walter Kampner. So a significant inverse association was found in this study between a higher adherence to a plant-based dietary pattern and the risk of type 2 diabetes. And it was strengthened when there were healthier plant-based foods, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, believe it or not. So very powerful, 30% reduction in risk for diabetes. How about kidneys? Many of you may or may not know this, but kidney disease is the enemy of it is protein consumption. Too much protein actually taxes the kidneys. When you eat a plant-based diet, you probably get the right amount of protein as opposed to too much, like most Americans. So in this large study of about 630,000 adults without chronic kidney disease at baseline, followed for 10 years, you follow a healthy dietary pattern, you have 30% lower odds of developing kidney disease and 23% lower odds of peeing out protein. So again, pretty amazing. How about ultra-processed foods? So if you eat ultra-processed foods, which are, convenience foods or things like ramen noodles that are ready to go, they follow 20,000 participants here. Participants in the highest quarter of ultra-processed food consumption, they died 62% more often. For each additional serving, the all-cause mortality went up by about 18%. So if you eat 6 servings, it sounds like you might end up dying. And of course that's an extrapolation, but I always joke, if each additional serving raises your risk by 18%, what happens if you go above 100%? Who knows? And then greater than 4 servings a day was independently associated with marked increase in mortality. So please stay away from packaged foods, processed foods, ready-to-eat foods that have been significantly tampered with by man. And if you look, here's minimally processed over here, pre-cut produce, bagged greens, etc., all the way to microwave dinners, frozen pizzas, pastries, candy, soft drinks, and protein bars. Instant noodles, the college mainstay. I always joke with my patients that are still eating them. If you can eat for 26 cents, you probably are eating for too cheap. It's not worth to eat these instant ramen noodles. And then again, in this study, 105,000 participants were followed, and they registered their usual consumption of 3,300 food items with regular ultra-processed food consumption, 12% increased risk in heart disease, stroke, and coronary heart disease. So really do your best to stay away from them if you can. How about eggs? So those of you who have seen my talks in years past, eggs are usually not ideal. Data from 30,000 participants in 6 studies followed for about 18 years. Each 300 milligram dose of dietary cholesterol increased the risk of heart disease by 17% and mortality by 18%. Each half of an egg caused a 6% more cardiovascular disease and 8% more death. So if you're eating a dozen eggs a week, think about that. That's a lot of these increases in death and heart disease. So try to limit them or eliminate them if you can. The authors concluded that higher consumption of dietary cholesterol eggs was significantly associated with higher risk of death. And these should be considered in the next dietary guidelines. I urge you to write your congressman, legislator, senator, whatever. The U.S. dietary guidelines for Americans will be updated in the next year or less. So make sure your voice is heard. There's also Neil Barnard, a friend of mine and collaborator, did this review recently where he looked at all the different egg studies that were out there. Research published prior to 1970 showed no industry influence, but industry-funded studies increased over time from 0% in the 1950s to 60% in the last decade. 85% of all studies show eggs have unfavorable effects on blood cholesterol, but industry-funded studies were much more likely to downplay these findings compared with just 13% of non-industry funded trials. So you can see industry is starting to significantly influence our dietary guidelines. How about dairy? Another study, 18,000 participants, Nurses Health Study, consuming the most dairy, highest mortality, cardiovascular mortality, and cancer mortality. If you replace it with beans, whole grains, or nuts, the risk for death goes down. When it's replaced with red and processed meat, the risk goes up. Worse outcomes for whole milk were noted. Replacing meat, by the way, with dairy is a bit of a trick. When studies find a reduced risk for death with dairy consumption, you can imagine that if you switch from eating, red meat every day to lower fat milk, you can imagine people would do better. But that doesn't mean that they're doing the right thing, because compared to plants, they're still doing quite poorly. And then this was an interesting study, 96,000 7-day Adventists with diets assessed by questionnaire. If they did eat red processed meats, the risk of death went up by 23% and all-cause mortality by 34%. Interestingly, there was no association with just processed meats, although similar rates with unprocessed red meat. And those who consume the most unprocessed red meat had lower intakes of fruits and vegetables, which is also no surprise. A lot of people think that dinner is steak or fish, and it really should be large and larger amounts of vegetables and fruits. How about vision? So people, as you may know, it's epidemic now for vision loss, macular degeneration, etc. So this is 18 years of follow-up, diets high in red and processed meat, fried foods, high-fat dairy. 3 times increased incidence rate for late macular degeneration when compared to those who follow healthier diets. So if you care about your vision, eat plants. How about in this study, 36 studies, 1,800 participants. Those who ate the most red meat with eating habits that replaced that red meat with other foods like legumes had marked improvements in cholesterol. But if you replace red meat with fish, it did not improve the risk of heart disease. Again, not a new finding, but a new way of presenting it. Here's another one. This was from the Quopio Ischemic Heart Disease Factor Study, 2,600 participants. Those who consume more meat and protein from animal-based sources in place of plant-based sources died almost a quarter more of the time. Even more evidence, 30,000 adults from 6 prospective studies. The risk for all-cause mortality was 3% higher in people who ate red or processed meat, excluding fish, twice a week. So again, if you're not seeing the signal and the noise here, I'm not sure how else to tell you. Eating more plant-based is truly the best way to stay well. This was the Journal of the American Heart Association studies. They compared 4 different dietary patterns. Higher adherence to a plant-based diet resulted in 25% lower risk of any cause of death and 19% from heart disease. How about in the Japanese experience? So this was 71,000 Japanese adults followed for 18 years. When you ate more plant protein, mortality dropped 13% and 30% for heart disease. Beans, they truly are good for your heart. 28 study analysis, those who consume the most legumes, less heart disease and hypertension by up to 10%, and obesity was reduced by 13%. And this was an interesting thing. 12,000 Buddhist volunteers in Taiwan, they compared a diet with frequent consumption of fruits, vegetables, and soy to a diet characterized by meat and fish. Vegetarians, 15% lower total medical costs, 13% lower outpatient medical costs, lower expenses related to all the usual suspects, hypertension, high cholesterol, depression, heart disease, and kidney disease. And when compared to Taiwan's general population, vegetarians were 25% less expensive. This is why you're seeing some insurers give discounts to plant-based eaters. And if you're not getting such a discount, ask. You might be surprised what's out there. This is from the American Society of Nephrology, the kidney docs. They said here, they did a study on plant-based diets, a review article. There is growing evidence, although be it observational, that plant-based or DASH, which is a predominantly plant-based diet, in individuals with chronic kidney disease may delay progression to dialysis by changing their diet, of all things, believe it or not. How about TMAO? So we've talked about this in years past. TMAO is produced by gut flora when you're an omnivore, when you eat meat, particularly carnitine. So if you follow a high-fat Atkins or a Mediterranean or a South Beach versus an Ornish plant-based low-fat diet, you had marked levels of TMAO, and then another branched chain amino acid called valine and leucine. And these branched chain amino acids have been associated with insulin resistance. So more and more we're finding that the gut flora plays a critical role in what we do. Paleo diets were also studied recently this year, and it showed that researchers tracked the TMAO levels following these types of diets. And when they ate less carbs, increased fat, they led to more gut bacteria species, one of them called Hungetella, which is linked to heart disease, inflammation, and TMAO. So again, bad news. How about in this keto diet? This was a study of 17 men, 4 weeks of a baseline diet, followed by 4 weeks of an isocaloric ketogenic diet. And switching to the ketogenic diet was associated with increased cholesterol and inflammatory markers. And I would tell you that I'd be the first to tell you I've treated a number of young people who've been on a keto diet for an extended period of time, who've developed a heart attack while on this diet. And of course, it's hard to pinpoint just the diet, but they really had almost no other risk factor. Very interesting. And then a keto diet may also help to promote short-term weight loss, and I would agree with that. I've seen people gain weight, but if most people do lose weight, as Michael Greger says, that might mean skinnier coffins. But this leads to increased low-density cholesterol, the LDL, the bad stuff, and weight loss using a keto diet was like results from diets that allow greater carbohydrate consumption. No apparent significant differences between low-carb and other diets for other cardiometabolic health markers. So there's a lot of hype out there. A lot of it is sponsored by some of the companies that are producing ketogenic products and diets. So just be wary what you're seeing. So the mean consumption of processed meat in U.S. adults is unchanged in the past 18 years. We've made success in dairy. You may have seen dairy consumption is actually going down, and some of the dairies are actually closing. But the top 5 processed meats consumed by U.S. adults in 2016 were lunch meat, sausage, hot dogs, ham, and bacon. Just today I'm at work, and two of our medical assistants, both of who are pregnant, eating eggs and sausage for lunch, for breakfast. It's very, very hard to get that message, even with men nudging. How about spaghetti? So this is an interesting study of just 7 men, but when they were fed lycopene, which is found in tomatoes, when they were given with high iron levels, the absorption was actually limited. So if you eat tomato sauce without the meat, you actually absorb the iron better. Interesting. And as I have always said, the root cause for virtually every disease that we treat is inflammation. So dietary habits were scored here on the inflammatory effects and the antioxidant content and compare cancer risk. And when you ate the most inflammatory diet, you have the highest risk for colorectal cancer. In this study, 93% more often. And the highest intakes of pro-inflammatory products also were associated with more breast cancer compared with the least intake. How about rheumatoid arthritis? So great documentary you should consider watching if you haven't seen it, called Eating You Alive. Talks a lot about autoimmune disease and rheumatologic disease. But there's actually significant data suggesting that nutrition interventions can slow or even halt the disease process. And what they found here is that several studies have shown that other RA symptoms may be modified by dietary factors. Excessive body weight, diets high in animal products exacerbate these rheumatologic symptoms due to their pro-inflammatory effects, whereas diets rich in vegetables, fruits, and fiber are associated with being skinnier and have anti-inflammatory properties. So even if you have a genetic risk for something, it's all about the environment you put your genes in. If you put those genes in a good environment, they may never express, which is pretty great. How about heart failure? Again, an extremely common epidemic disease state. This was a study of about 16,000 participants, 8.7 years of follow-up. Plant-based diets can reduce the risk of heart failure by up to 41%. And if you like the Southern diet, you have a 72% greater risk. So they call it the stroke belt in the South, but really it should be the stroke and heart attack and heart failure belt because they all go together. So stay away from that if you can. Interestingly, you can see here that if you can eat a plant-based diet, your risk of heart failure goes down, Southern diet goes up, and the rest of it don't have a direct effect on heart failure, although they do certainly affect other risk factors. So how about sugar-sweetened beverages, or SSBs? So again, you know that from years past, both diet soda and sugar-sweetened beverages are bad news when it comes to health. So in this study, 37,000 men from the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, 80,000 from the Nurses Health Study. They followed 36,000 deaths, 3.5 million person years. When you had more sugar-sweetened beverages, positive association with total mortality, which was concordant with the dose, which means the more of these you drink, the worse you do. And then artificially sweetened beverages also had more mortality, but not cancer at higher levels. So again, I really recommend, as good as they are, and remember that the soda companies have figured out the perfect recipe for human brains to become addicted. So if you are addicted to Coke or Diet Coke, and I would argue lots of us in medical school certainly were, spend the 2 weeks it takes to get your brain off of these things. It was truly worth it for your health. Here's another study, 400,000 adults in Europe, 2 glasses a day of sugar-sweetened or artificially sweetened soft drinks, 17% higher risk of premature death. So I think the death nail is in the coffin here. Stay away from this. I'll also tell you, if you're really interested, if I told you I had a solution I wanted you to drink that you can use to dissolve clogs in your plumbing, or if you put a penny in it, it disappears by the next day, would you drink it? You'd say no, except that you then would have a Coca-Cola or a Pepsi, and it does just that. So remember, if plumbers are carrying it on their truck and they're using it to get rid of clogs, I don't recommend drinking. How about, is it the plastics that they come in? So you may have seen microplastics are everywhere, and this was a really shocking study. This was in the remote French Pyrenees Mountains. They're finding tiny bits of microplastics blown from big cities like Barcelona and others. You think that you're protected when you live in these beautiful remote regions, but our Earth is one Earth. And even if your country decides to ban all the single-use plastics, your neighbors may churn them out. And if this developing model of airborne contamination holds true, they could blow your way. So it's no different than climate change. We've got to tackle it together. And I would tell you that all of us right now have microplastics in our body. sadly. And then there was another review of this, an editorial, and this is in the Annals of Internal Medicine. And basically what they said is there is an urgent need to focus on potential evidence of microplastic accumulation in the gut or at sites where biopersistent particles and fibers are likely to accumulate in the body, such as lymph nodes. And this will become increasingly important. Here's an interesting study about Crohn's disease, an inflammatory bowel condition. This is a case report. And it turns out that this was a patient who was very refractory. And when they got rid of animal products and they also did a little bit of fasting, they were able to get rid of their Crohn's and put it into remission. So what I would tell you is that inflammation control is always the answer. And not only does it help with lots of inflammatory conditions, in my field, it's one of the most potent anti-anginals that has ever been seen. How about in preterm labor? You might be surprised to find out that diet has an effect on that too. So 32 studies were analyzed, and a plant-based diet led to lower risk for preterm birth and spontaneous preterm birth. And in the United States, 1 in 10 births are preterm, and about a third of neonatal deaths. So wouldn't it be amazing if our diet improved our fertility rates and our drop in neonatal deaths? And the answer is there's data to support both of those. How about depression? So 3 weeks, 76 teens were asked to eat better with more veggies and fruits. And when they cut down on the processed foods and increased fruit, vegetables, in this case fish, they actually had improvements in their depression. How about chocolate? Well, chocolate overall is actually quite good for us, it turns out, but you want to make sure it's not adulterated with dairy or too much sugar. So in this case, 14,000 adults were followed. People who ate the most chocolate, 104 grams, had a 57% lower risk for depression compared with people who did not eat chocolate. 45 grams is 1 chocolate bar. So I don't recommend that you eat tons of chocolate, but it does work. If you're depressed, just don't overdo it. And of course, you're at risk for kidney stones if you eat a lot of chocolate because it contains something called oxalate. You could also just get a dog, right? So don't eat the dog, of course, like they do in some parts of the world. But 10 studies here, about 4 million participants. When you had a dog, you had a 24% risk reduction for dying. And individuals with prior coronary events had less death by a 65%. And overall mortality, dog ownership conferred a 31% risk reduction for heart-related death. So get a dog. And brush your teeth. Most people don't realize, but dental health and cardiovascular disease are intimately related, probably due to inflammation. So in this study, they followed 161,000 people in South Korea. If you brush your teeth 3 times a day, you have a 12% lower risk for heart failure and a 10% lower risk for developing an arrhythmia called atrial fibrillation, which is also epidemic. Now, I don't know about you, but most people in the United States brush their teeth around 2 times a day. So if you can get a third in, that's great. And before you start skipping meals, this was an interesting study that came out this year showing 6,500 adults, after adjusting for age, sex, race, socioeconomic status, diet, lifestyle, body mass index, and disease, those who never had breakfast had an 87% higher risk of cardiovascular mortality. And I would tell you that the data that's emerging on intermittent fasting is actually quite promising. But I would tell you that the definition of breakfast may change. So if it's your first meal of the day, it may be breakfast. I don't know. So who knows? And in this case, you can see here that if you never skip breakfast, you're actually much less likely to have cardiovascular disease. And if you skip it every day, cardiovascular disease, it may be on the range that may be less good for you. So, see what you can do. So don't skip breakfast too often. How about intermittent fasting?
Can't hear him anymore.
What's that? Can you hear me still?
Oh, thank you, Dr. Freeman. There was just a moment that I couldn't hear you. So,
So intermittent fasting, also, this is an interesting series. 12 articles came out, 545 individuals. Intermittent fasting was associated with significant reduction in body mass index, fasting glucose, and insulin resistance. And drop in fat mass and a hormone called leptin was associated with the intermittent fasting diet, and lean mass remained unchanged. So I think there may be some significant evidence, and there's more and more individuals out there that are talking about sort of not only restricting the foods you eat, but restricting the time that you eat them in for a really big boost in weight loss. Now, how about cow's milk and food allergies? So we talked about this before. Dairy milk in babies seems to cause more problems than it may help unless you're in a very resource-poor environment. But milk sensitization was present in about 32% of 2-year-olds and those who got cow's milk formula right after birth. And food allergy was significantly less prevalent in unexposed 2-year-olds, especially for the immediate and anaphylactic or life-threatening types. So if you can avoid cow's milk-based formula with your baby, feel free to do that. It's much better overall for a variety of things, not just food allergies. How about this thing called thermic burn, right? The effect of food increase that can boost the metabolic rate. If you eat a larger plant-based meal and higher in carbohydrates, you can actually increase your post-meal burn, which may help with weight management. And when combined with increased physical activity, plant-based eating also improves the thermic effect of food, which may help with obesity and diabetes. Exercise is truly the antidote to sitting. And for many, moderate exercise of 30 minutes a day on most days of the week was enough to offset the health risks of sitting. So the authors say sitting is bad, and moderate to vigorous physical activity equivalent to meeting the current recommendations attenuate or eliminate some of these associations. So if you find yourself sitting throughout the day, do your best to get a workout in almost every day, if not every day. But be careful. 1 in 50,000 marathoners suffers a cardiac arrest. The first marathoner ever, back in Greek lore, died. So you want to make sure that you are doing your best, if you can, to use exercise in moderation. High proportion of exercise-induced cardiac events occur during marathons, especially when you're 35 and above. How about angina and acupuncture? As you may know, I'm a big fan of acupuncture. I always tell people that Eastern medicine has been around a lot longer than Western medicine. 404 participants, 20 weeks followed acupuncture on the disease-affected meridian versus a sham or even no acupuncture was actually quite effective for anti-anginal therapy. It really works. So if you have a patient with refractory angina, plant-based diet first step, and if it still persists, consider a trial of acupuncture. How about coffee? We all love coffee, and I would tell you again, the fastest way to convert a 2-calorie per cup beverage into a 2,000 calorie per cup beverage is to go to your favorite coffee shop and ask them for the whipped super frappuccino, yada, yada. So drink it black or with unsweetened soy or almond milk. 40 studies here, 4 million subjects, 3.5 cups of coffee per day dropped all-cause death by 15%. 2.5 cups reduced the risk for heart disease by 17%. 2 cups per day was the lowest relative risk of cancer. So there seems to be significant benefit in caffeinated coffee, provided you're not sensitive. So check with your doctor first. But make sure you filter it. We know for a long time now, but filtered coffee seems to have a big effect on health and lower diabetes. We also know that unfiltered coffee, so for all of you Turkish coffee lovers, it actually can raise cholesterol. So in this study, protective role of habitual intake of filtered coffee. And I want to highlight something. If you drink coffee intermittently, it can raise your blood pressure and cause problems. So if you're going to drink coffee, you ought to drink it habitually. It won't have an effect on your blood pressure or your arrhythmia risk, and appears to reduce some of the bad outcomes in health. Also consider keeping your food spiced. This was an interesting study, 22,000 men and women in something called the Molisani study. All-cause mortality was 23% lower among those who consumed chili pepper 4 times a week compared to those who reportedly weren't eating it at all. So enjoy spice. Coconut oil, we know, very, very good topically. It makes your hair shiny. Also is not great for your heart. 16 publications should suggest that this can increase cholesterol by 10 or more points. And in general, the guidelines recommend if you do consume oil at all, to avoid anything at all that's tropical oil. How about walnuts? So a randomized crossover controlled feeding study was conducted. Replacement, of saturated fatty acids with unsaturated fats from walnuts or vegetable oils improved LDL. And it did not increase Lp(a), which is a risk factor for heart disease. And even if you press the hardest stalwarts that are anti-nut and anti-oil, they'll tell you that probably a walnut a day probably isn't a bad thing. And this year, I'm pleased to say there were some wins, even though it feels like a pretty off year. 2020 will certainly go down in history books as such a bizarre year. But first ever legislation incentivizing plant-based school lunch options in California came forward. Disney's US theme parks, they're now open again, and they actually have lots of vegan options. New York passed a bill that requires plant-based meals in hospitals following California last year. Billie Eilish begs 26 million fans to be smarter and go vegan. So it's starting to hit the younger people who are understanding that the planet they're about to inherit may not be the planet that we all know. The Golden Globes actually went meatless. They had a plant-based award ceremony dinner. Again, a big move in the right direction when we can really, show celebrities following this approach. And dairy, as I mentioned earlier, Dean Foods, America's largest milk producer, filed for bankruptcy, 94-year-old company. Milk production is certainly on the way down. And again, I don't wish any badness on any company, but I think it may be time for some of these companies to diversify, which is why you're finding so many of the meat producers investing in plant-based foods because they see the future. And we're sort of mainstreaming these resolutions. So Veganuary wanted to be your 2020 food resolution. And this was in the Washington Post. And believe it or not, 1 in 4 Americans are eating less meat for health reasons. 23% of Americans ate less meat in the past year. 19% of white participants reported cutting back on meat. Even stronger among other races, rural and Midwestern populations were less likely to reduce their meat intake, however. So sometimes old habits die hard. Some losses, though. So the Welsh minister rejects the call to reduce meat intake eating to tackle climate change. Not sure why Wales was doing that, but so be it. And then we lost the Food Network star Carl Ruiz. I think he was 44. Pretty unfortunate to lose a guy like that from heart disease. So we need to make these changes, and we need to make them mainstream and let people know about it. This was an advertisement in a hospital, a good friend of mine's hospital in Indiana, for a new cafeteria offering. Bacon makes everything merrier. So we still have some work to do, especially in the Midwest, but you can imagine you see a flyer for that, you just recovered from your heart attack, or you're visiting your family member who just had bypass surgery, and you go grab a bacon sandwich, really is not congruent with a place of health, sadly. We also know that stress is bad, and stress is particularly bad this time of year, especially with COVID-19. So 130,000 people with stress-related disorders were matched with a 1.4 million unexposed over 27 years. Cardiovascular disease was very common amongst these folks, and there was high hazard ratios risk for cardiac arrest, stroke, heart rhythm disorders, heart failure, especially after the first year of significant stress. So we have to do our best to really not only manage the heart disease, but some of the risk factors, including stress. Interestingly, there was a study of meditation, cardiac PET, 56 African-American heart disease patients. If they practiced transcendental meditation, in addition to cardiac rehab, they increased blood flow by 21% to their heart. If they did meditation alone, 13% increased myocardial blood flow. Rehab alone, 6% increased myocardial blood flow, and a drop of 10.3% overall with just standard treatment. So you can imagine that getting your mind into it really matters. And one of the things I always tell people is the very word we use, disease, is really dis-ease, lack of ease. And when we can restore ease to our mind and our body, health usually ensues. And then this was an interesting statement. The AAP, American Academy of Pediatrics, and the Heart Association, the joint policy statement recommended taxation of sugary drinks, which, as you know, has been tried and intermittently successful in different cities. Finally, I like to show this slide always. There is a great way to lower your cholesterol risk, which then lowers your heart disease risk, simply with dietary interventions, cutting fat, cholesterol, adding plant stanols, increasing dietary fiber, soy, almonds, and losing a little weight can drop sometimes cholesterol by as much as 50%, which is exactly what we're trying to do with high-intensity statins. And it doesn't mean this replaces that, but it significantly can cut risk. There was an interesting trial that came out in the last year called the ischemia trial. The primary outcome was death, heart attack, and hospitalization. And even when you have moderate degrees of blockage, there was no significant differences. I'll put a quick plug into a program called Intensive Cardiac Rehab, which is now available in many parts of our country. This one is based on the Ornish model. And when you go through this program, you get 4 hours of plant-based nutrition, exercise, stress management, and group support. And it actually has amazing improvements in reversing heart disease. So if you know someone who's been through heart disease, has angina or heart failure, their insurer will cover this program, and the results are truly astounding. Just to give you an example of some of the outcomes we got this last year, when we put people through this program, which is only 9 weeks, 2 months long, you can see that people lost weight, body mass index, cholesterol, blood pressure, hemoglobin A1C. They got less depressed, their exercise capacity increased. So really powerful results with no additional medicine at all. So you can see why it's so powerful. And then I'll point out that exercise, of course, is critical to what we do. 1,300 adults were overweight. There's a hormone glucagon-like peptide 1 decreases blood glucose. They were 20% lower for each hour of moderate physical activity, at least in this case, in this study in men. But I would argue women, it's just as beneficial. Really interesting study came out that was published in National Geographic, How to Feed the World Without Destroying the Planet. And when the world's population hits 10 billion in 2050, it's going to be eating a predominantly plant-based diet, which will sustain the planet and us. And they said here that we have to shift the diets of high meat consumers toward plant-based foods. For growing populations that have access to meat, others will have to consume less and see what we can do. It also will provide 600 billion in subsidies to the agriculture that favor meat and dairy. That should be phased out. So really good points in National Geographic. Another one, to help save the planet, cut back to a hamburger and a half per week. I would tell you to cut back to 0 hamburgers per week. But in short, Americans will need to cut their meat consumption of beef in particular by 40% if we want to feed 10 billion people by 2050. Pretty amazing. So see what you can do. And the UN climate change report, and this was in Nature, calls for change to human diet. The report on global land use and deforestation of the Amazon is saying we got to change what we do. Here's the stats here. It says that if we ate less meat, this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, examined the estimated impact on greenhouse gas emissions. You could see that if we really cut back, we could significantly drop our greenhouse gas emissions. And as the temperature goes up, a spike of just 1.5 degrees Celsius was linked to an estimated 1,600 deaths as a result of injuries, while a rise at 2 degrees Celsius was linked to about 2,000 degrees. And that's because of suicides, assault, transport accidents, drownings, and falls, just on a few degrees, believe it or not. And we know that if it's good for us, it's good for the planet. So the same dietary changes that could help reduce the risk of diet-related non-communicable diseases could also improve international sustainability. And we know here that the impact here on the environment versus relative risk for mortality is markedly improved for vegetables, whereas processed and unprocessed meats, bad for the environment, bad for your health. So again, you want to stay in this nice lower category. How about in cities? 26 healthy, non-smoking young adults from Los Angeles, we measured blood levels of pollution breakdown products after they took a trip to Beijing, one of the more polluted cities in the world. And over 6 to 8 weeks, pollution metabolites in the patient's urine spiked. And this thing called a polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon was 176%, up to 800% higher than in Los Angeles, which is also not that good. But there's some good news. Again, California budget boosts healthy food for kids in markets and farmers. We found out here that there's an $80 million budgetary proposal from the governor for school food programming serving 3.5 million children. Hopefully the rest of the country will follow suit. And as you may have seen here, the vegan KFC burger officially sold out in 4 days. There were lines around the block, double looped around the building, as this one said here. Again, wouldn't recommend you consume these regularly, but certainly a far better approach than the usual. Here's the billboard of the year. This is a real billboard, believe it or not. This is from McDonald's. What I would tell you as a cardiologist when I saw this first, this is an extremely abnormal rhythm. And then when we see these things called tombstones, which in this case make an M for McDonald's, tombstones are associated with heart attack and death. So as a cardiologist, this is a very scary billboard, even though they try to appeal to the consumer. And it really should say, I'm dying with it, not I'm living it. And finally, I would tell you, with all these hurricanes coming, this is a real picture from a grocery store. People would rather starve than to eat vegan food. So I, look forward to it when there are storms. There's always plenty of food for the people who are not eating meat. So at the end, what is success? It's 100% whole grain, minimally processed, whole food, plant-based diet that's low in fats. Albert Einstein always says nothing will benefit our health and increase our chance for survival on Earth as the evolution to a vegetarian diet. And I would encourage you to check out a couple of great programs that help to support this. In Denver and across the country, we do a great program called Walk with a Doc, which of course is on hold due to our social distancing right now. But we've been doing it for about 10 years. We've reached several thousand Denver citizens, and we really do our best to walk the walk and talk the talk. And I would encourage you to check your local Walk with a Doc at walkwithadoc.org. And then here in Denver, we have a transitioning to plant-based support group led by a chef who is really wonderful and helps people get on the plant-based wagon and stay on. Of course, we put it on hold also due to social distancing, hoping to resume next month. And if you're not convinced, do your own research. It's always better when you look at it, when you examine the data, when you see what's out there, because once you go back, once you leave the zone of ignorance, it's very, very hard to come back. And with that, I'll leave some time for questions.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Freeman. This was, I've been taking notes. I learned so much. Like, I mean, that blows my mind that we have microplastics, all of us in our bodies. That is just not good. Make sure you take yourself off screen share, Dr. Freeman, so that we can see you.
So sorry about that.
No, that's okay. And that the mummies already had heart disease. That is so amazing. I did.
It's interesting. If you look, the vast majority of mummies, particularly in Egypt, were the royalty. And so they were eating a lot of the meats and other things, the fancy foods. Many of them died and then had, perfectly preserved bodies that would be CAT scanned. Remember, the peasants, the commoners, were eating the grains.
I think that was so great that you pointed out how the processed food industry knows how to make our brains addictive. That was a great point. And I love that you pointed out that pound for pound, green vegetables have more protein than meat, but people just seem to forget that. There were a lot of people that were happy to hear you, say chocolate was okay. And of course dogs, but they're worried if they have cats, will they still have the same benefit?
It's interesting. I have not seen a study recently on cats, but I would tell you that, if you have an animal that makes your eyes light up and makes you feel like you have the love and support of that animal, I think, that sort of unconditional love is really where the data is. And there's been data year after year, actually, that has shown simply love, support, social support markedly improves health outcomes. So I think that's really what it is.
Right. Because when I've heard you speak before, you talk about what I believe are your 5 pillars of health, and that connection is one of them.
Absolutely. So the things that I tell patients, the secret to success, if you will, is eating plants, exercising more, stressing less, loving or connecting more, and sleeping more, 7 hours a night uninterrupted. When those 5 things are harmonized and synergized, the results are extraordinary.
And when you talked about exercise, I believe you said, because you're the doc when they walk with the doc, that it has to be at least 30 minutes, but it has to be breathless. It can't just be like la di da di da di da.
Yeah. So it's interesting to me. I see a lot of my patients tell me, doc, I'm 75 or I'm 85, and I go and I do water aerobics. And I say, oh, really? And I said, do you go with anyone else? They say, oh, yes. So they spend the whole time bouncing up and down the water, talking to their neighbor, which is very good for their social support, but does very little for their health. And the same is true for walking. But for vehicles, we walk 10 miles a day, easy, no trouble. But the goal is to walk breathlessly enough, check with your doctor first, to be able to not have a conversation, meaning the person you go with talks to you, always good for the relationship, and you can't talk back for 30 minutes, which is always a plus. But that is what lowers blood pressure and improves one's condition.
That's neat. Well, I'll go through the questions that were sent in first, and then if there's still time, a couple that were asked live. But Nicole asked, how do you feel about what some of the younger plant-based cardiologists are saying about olive oil being good, and that the old guys like Esselstyn and Ornish, they don't read the research?
It's an interesting debate, and I would tell you it's very hard to know if oil is good or bad or small amounts are good. If you look at the work that Esselstyn and Ornish look at, first, lower fat does seem to be better. It doesn't have to be no fat, but lower fat. There is data that suggests that oils and high-fat surges can shut down endothelial function, which is the lining of blood vessels. That's where Esselstyn comes from. The question is, if it's an oil that is not mechanically or high heat extracted, say olive oil, right, where you pinch an olive and the quote unquote juice that comes out is oil, is that beneficial? And there is some data out there suggesting it might be. The question is how much? And so I usually tell people, if they are going to consume oil, to consume it in the least amount that they can possibly do. And if they have heart disease already, to try to eliminate it altogether. That's the my synthesizing of all of the experts and the data that's out there. Now, I could be wrong. I tell people it's very possible Estelson might be spot on that, avoiding oil altogether makes sense. And the reason for that is one other thing. When the body gets oil outside of the matrix of the plant, when it comes in a purified form, similar to the way when we take cocoa, right? When we take cocaine out of the beans, the body doesn't know how to react and it creates problems. So that may be true. So what I always tell people is use it in very moderation, meaning as little as you can. And if you have disease already, consider it.
That's great. Thank you. Just so you know, you've got fans. Lori says, Dr. Freeman rocks and is cute. So,
well, thanks, Lori, wherever you are. Appreciate it.
Okay. So Aurora said, my husband had a heart attack 2 years ago, 3 stents put in. We immediately went plant-based. All his numbers are good now. She's cheap. I'm not going to listen, but they look good. But his cardiologist continues to keep him on a statin and blood thinner, Clopidogrel, whatever. He went to the dentist recently and the dentist said it was hard to get him to stop bleeding. Is there any hope he could ever be medication free?
So just a couple of important points, right? So we know from Western medicine that there's an extremely strong evidence base for what we do after someone has a heart attack. So if you look, when someone has a stent put in, staying on the Plavix is life-saving because it prevents the stent from clogging up acutely and killing somebody. But usually after a year, it can go, and just a plain old baby aspirin is all you need. Now, again, your situation may be different. As for the statin, I get this question all the time. Well, doc, if I follow this fully plant-based diet, can I come off the statin? We actually don't know the answer to that question. So what I tell people is we know that statins, especially high-intensity statins, lower the risk of heart attack, stroke, and death markedly after a cardiovascular event. We also know that following a low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet and those 5 pillars I just talked about also significantly lower the cardiovascular risk. The question is it synergistic? And I think it probably is, meaning if we put people on the best of Western medicine and the best of Eastern medicine, and they tolerate it, and that makes their risk as low as possible, is that worth doing? And that's a very individualized question that needs to be discussed with your doctor. And the truth is we don't know. And so I tell people, if you stop your statin, you're welcome to do that, but realize you might be leaving risk on the table. And so it's a very individualized response that needs to be there.
Great. Thank you. Melanie says, could you please ask Dr. Freeman about hyperhidrosis? My almost 20-year-old son gets really sweaty more than most when his heart rate is increased, either through exercise or when adrenaline is high with competitive computer gaming. Is there anything Dr. Freeman knows that could help this condition?
Hyperhidrosis, I'm not expert in. I usually recommend visiting with a dermatologist. There are a number of procedures and medicines that are available for it. I'm not sure about the nutritional approach for it. I guess what I would say is I would encourage your son, was it a son? Is that right?
Yeah, that's her son. Okay. Well, we don't have to worry because we have a plant-based cardiologist, Dr. Jessica Krant, that likes to come on my show once a month. And if she'll write back, we can get that answered.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I would encourage your son to also make sure that he gets out and exercises to get his heart rate down.
That's great. And at least 30 minutes and breathless. I'm going to remember that. When I'm on my spin bike and I start to slack, I'm going to think about, nope, I'm not breathless yet.
Yes. No, I've been happy to say I have one of those Peloton bikes, and today hit my personal record, and I was truly breathless.
Yeah. I am so drenched when I get off the bike, it's just, it makes it hard because I wish, because then I have to wash my hair before the show. And I should come do it once when I get off the bike and tell people what I really, really look like. Or we can do this again with both of us on the bike. That might be a fun episode.
That might be hard for me to talk, though.
Yeah. Susan says, do I need to take a statin if my cholesterol without statins is at 206 and my cholesterol with a statin is 160? I'm now 75, whole food plant-based for the last 6 years, heart attack 2013. And then she gives all the numbers, which are good. Plant-based cardiologist says yes to the statin. And my plant-based primary care doctor says, no, I know you cannot advise me, but I would like your general opinion.
Yeah, so general opinion is this. What we know from best Western evidence is to take your numbers and put them into this 10-year ASCVD risk estimator, which basically tells us what your risk of a heart attack or stroke is over the next 10 years. Just by virtue of your age alone, you're going to fall into the higher risk category, right? We all die, and the likelihood of dying from heart disease in this country as you get older is very high. So if you said to me, well, what can I do to cut my risk the most? It's to follow an excellent lifestyle and probably stay on the statin. Now, if you said to me, I don't want to be on the statin, I'll take my chances, then I'll say, okay, but we may be leaving risk on the table. So again, you really should have, not that someone tells you what to do, but you have a shared decision with your physicians.
Thank you. Okay. Kit says, I have high lipoprotein A at 232 nmol-ml, which is the very high risk category from my understanding. Is LDL level around 80 okay, or should I strive for 70 with this risk factor? Second question, if time permits, I take no statins, but was told by a couple of cardiologists I should take an 81 milligram aspirin because of small risk of arterial thrombosis with high LPA. Do you agree?
So when you have high LP(a), for those of you that are not familiar, that's the thing that Bob from The Biggest Loser had and ended up having a premature heart attack at a young age in pretty good shape. He was not plant-based though. What I tell people is high LP(a) is a genetic predisposition that needs to be taken very seriously. Most of my high LP(a) patients I do have on a statin and an excellent lifestyle, and I would encourage you to speak with your doctors about that. Aspirin also is an individualized decision. The guidelines would suggest that unless you've had a heart attack or stroke, the benefit is not necessarily there. If you have, or you want to take it, or you have very early family history, you could certainly take the medicine, the aspirin, but again, it needs to be decided with your physician on an individual level.
Great. And Dina, who's watching live, wants to know what you think about red wine. Does it lower blood pressure? Because when she drinks it, hers goes down to 110/78.
Well, I would argue that any form of relaxation can sometimes lower blood pressure. So if the wine helps you relax at the end of the day, that could be it. But I would encourage the audience not to start drinking if they're not drinking already. And further, I would caution that alcohol in women has been associated with a potential risk for breast cancer. So what I usually tell people is if they wish to drink in moderation, a glass of wine or less per day. There is data that suggests that no wine, your risk is sort of here. And then as you drink one glass, it goes down and then it goes up exponentially. So really don't overdo it. And I'm fine with you drinking a glass, but there could be a tiny little risk of breast cancer.
Wow. Well, good for you. Well, you're terrific. You have to be in Colorado to see you though. You're not doing some of the telemedicine like some of the other doctors are doing.
Yeah. So the telemedicine, like one of my good friends who's here in Colorado, you may know Lori Marvis. She managed to get licensed in virtually every state, which is a huge undertaking. I'm licensed to practice in Colorado, so you can fly out and come see me. You can do telemedicine in Colorado. But other than that, sadly, I'm restricted by my license to practice just in our state.
Well, I know everybody wishes they had a doctor like you. And thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise and your passion. I felt like I was at a conference watching your presentation. When you said you had a few slides, I had no idea this was going to be an amazing lecture.
Yeah, my pleasure. Well, every year I try to put together something like this. So happy to come back and try to do it.
Yeah, you have an open spot anytime you'd like to come on. Thank you so much, Dr. Freeman. I really appreciate it. It's so nice getting to know you a little bit better.
Definitely. Same here. Thanks,
Great.
everybody.
Yeah, thank you guys for watching, and please come back tomorrow at 11 when I'm going to be having as a guest Esther Loveridge, the author of From Donuts to Potatoes, and she's going to be doing a cooking demo. So I'm sure you made a lot of people happy today, Dr. Freeman, because some of the doctors we have on is like no chocolate, no wine, no coffee, and so like here's a cardiologist saying, well, maybe you can have a little. So I let people decide what's best for them.
Definitely, and it's important to have an open-minded, thorough discussion with your health.
Absolutely. Well, as some of our guests said, you rock and you're cute. So thanks so much.
Take care. Bye now.
Okay. Bye.